The morning mist draped over the mountains like a faded scroll. The sound of temple bells echoed softly through the valley as a young student made his way across the stone courtyard. His steps were quick, not with urgency, but with frustration. He had been here for weeks, no answers, no lessons, just silence and seemingly pointless tasks, sweeping dry leaves, watching steam rise from a cup of tea. Sitting in front of a stone-faced master who barely spoke, kneeling in front of the old monk, the student asked, again, "Master, why won't you answer my questions?" The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he raised one hand and pointed to the distant horizon, where the sun was just beginning to break through the clouds. And then, silence. That moment, empty to the untrained eye, is the doorway into one of the most mysterious and profound aspects of Eastern wisdom. Why do Japanese masters teach through silence and metaphors rather than formulas and instructions? To someone raised in a Western system full of textbooks, tests, lectures, and life hacks, this form of teaching can seem absurd. In our culture, knowledge is something to be transferred, copied, and optimized. If you want to learn something, there's a tutorial, a checklist, a TED Talk. Everything is designed to give you fast, digestible answers. But what if the very act of chasing answers was the obstacle? What if silence, yes, silence, isn't a lack of teaching, but the most powerful teaching of all? This isn't just a story about a monk and his student. This is about you, about the world we live in. A world that's addicted to information, but starving for wisdom. We've been taught to want formulas. We want someone to tell us what to do, what to believe, how to live, but Japanese masters don't do that. And there's a reason. In Zen, they say, words are fingers pointing at the moon, but don't mistake the finger for the moon. In other words, language isn't the truth, it only gestures toward it. The essence of learning isn't in memorizing concepts, it's in shifting perception, but we're not trained for that. We're trained to crave certainty. From an early age, we're conditioned to seek clarity. In school, we get points for right answers. In work, we're rewarded for following systems. Online, we're flooded with 3-step guides and 10x methods. The idea that truth might be ambiguous or that growth might require silence sounds almost offensive, yet that's precisely the point. Eastern masters are not here to make us comfortable. They're here to wake us up. Take the example of Hakuin Ikaku, one of Japan's most famous Zen masters. A student once came to him eager for enlightenment, but instead of providing teachings, Hakuin had him cut firewood and haul water for weeks. No lectures, no instructions. The student became restless, angry even, but something kept him there. Perhaps it was the calm in the master's presence. The way he walked, the way he listened, how even the smallest actions seemed to contain something more. And then one morning, as the student lit the fire for the bath, he stopped. There was no moment of thunderous insight. No divine revelation, just a quiet inner shift. Suddenly, everything made sense. That's the lesson. The master had been teaching all along, just not with words. This is the paradox of Eastern learning. The deepest truths can't be spoken. They can only be realized, and for that to happen, the student must be emptied. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is space. Space for awareness. Space for presence. Space for the insight to rise, not from the teacher, but from within. Psychologist and Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman explains how our brains work in 2 modes. System 1, fast, intuitive, automatic. System 2, slow, deliberate, reflective. Most of the time we operate in System 1. We want quick answers, we react, we assume. But wisdom lives in System 2, in the slow, quiet, uncomfortable process of questioning what we think we know. And that's why Zen masters are silent. They are forcing you, ever so gently, to pause, to shift out of the automatic, to enter the reflective. A 2013 study from the Harvard Business Review found that learning experiences involving self-reflection and observation led to significantly higher long-term retention than traditional instruction-based models. Another study published in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience in 2017 found that the brain actually becomes more creative and open when exposed to ambiguity and uncertainty, precisely the conditions created by a silent teacher. Silence activates attention. It opens space. It demands that we bring something of ourselves into the process. That's why Japanese masters often speak in metaphors instead of instructions. Take this classic exchange. A student asks, "What is enlightenment?" The master replies, "It's like seeing the moon reflected in a still pond." And what is ignorance? Trying to see the moon in a pond disturbed by your own hands. Could he have said, a state of clarity and equanimity? Sure, but would the student have felt it? Metaphors bypass logic. They go deeper. They stir the imagination. They open a door that formulas never could. According to George Lakoff, author of Metaphors We Live By, metaphors are not just linguistic tools, they're the very structure of our thinking. When we hear a metaphor, we engage more areas of the brain, including emotional and sensory regions. That's why stories endure. That's why myths matter. Because the heart remembers what the mind forgets. In Japanese culture, this metaphorical way of teaching isn't limited to monasteries. It's in the way tea is served, in how a garden is arranged, in the rhythm of martial arts, in the silence. Between notes in a koto melody, everything is part of the teaching. If the student is ready to observe, and when that shift happens, the student sees that the master is always teaching. Not through lectures, but through presence, the way he bows, the way he breathes, the way he tends the garden or pours the tea. These are not gestures, they are gateways. And the student, once desperate for answers, now begins to see, not with his eyes, but with his attention. He no longer interrupts the silence with questions. He lets it speak. And what it says is more powerful than any book, because the greatest teaching is not given, it is discovered. As this chapter ends, the student kneels once more before the master. This time, he asks nothing. He simply looks toward the horizon. The sun rises slowly, and for the first time, he doesn't seek meaning. He is present with it. Without even realizing it, the young student began to change. He still didn't have clear answers, but the master's silence no longer disturbed him. Slowly, his mind stopped racing. He swept the courtyard with care. He observed the steam rising from the teacup as if it were sacred smoke. The repetition of simple acts began to carry meaning. Then one day, the master spoke, for the first time in days. "When the water is cloudy," he said, "you can't see the bottom. But if you stop stirring it, clarity comes on its own." The student didn't reply. He didn't ask what it meant. For the first time, he didn't need to. In Western culture, we're trained to think in definitions. Everything must be labeled, categorized, quantified. But in Japan, and especially within Zen tradition, truth isn't handed out like a certificate. It's something that emerges, often in the spaces between what's said. In this space, metaphors become essential, not just as poetic devices, but as bridges between logic and intuition. As linguist George Lakoff explained, metaphors shape how we think, how we act, and how we feel. They're not ornamental, they're structural. They frame our perception of the world, and research backs this up. A 2016 study from Emory University found that metaphors light up multiple regions of the brain. Not just language centers, but also the sensory and emotional regions. For example, when someone hears the phrase, "he had a rough day," the brain actually activates tactile regions as if it were physically feeling that roughness. In short, metaphors make us feel truth, not just understand it. That's why Zen masters use them. So often, they don't want the student to recite the correct answer. They want the student to awaken. One of the core practices in Zen is working with koans, mysterious, paradoxical questions meant to defy rational thinking. The most famous is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? At first it seems absurd, but that's the point. A koan isn't meant to be solved. It's meant to collapse the intellect, to short-circuit the linear mind, to force the student to experience rather than explain. Zen master Daito Kokushi described the moment of realization like this. When a student holds the koan in deep meditation, with no way forward and no way back, heaven and earth collide, and in that collision, clarity is born. It may sound extreme, but think about your own life. How many of your biggest insights came after a breakdown, after silence, after the moment you let go of trying to figure it out? That's the wisdom hidden in metaphor and silence. They bypass the rationale. They invite the intuitive. They return us to presence. Take the legendary master Takuan Soho, who trained samurai not with strategy, but with stillness. One young warrior asked him how to conquer fear on the battlefield. Takuan didn't speak of courage or tactics. Instead, he said, "Look at the plum tree. In winter it does not resist, it waits, and in spring it blooms without effort." The student didn't understand at first. But years later, in the midst of battle, those words returned, and he finally understood. Because metaphors age with you. They ripen over time. They meet you at different levels as you grow. That's something formulas can't do. Modern science is starting to catch up with this ancient insight. A 2019 paper in the Educational Psychology Review showed that students who learned through analogy and storytelling had 30% higher retention compared to students who learned through instruction only. Formats. Another study in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience found that exposure to complex metaphor increases activity in brain regions responsible for empathy and creativity. And yet, despite this, our culture still favors clarity over ambiguity, speed over depth, answers over inquiry, but that approach leaves no room for wonder. Wonder needs space. It needs silence. It needs the kind of ambiguity that leads not to confusion, but to contemplation. Japanese culture nurtures this beautifully. In a traditional tea ceremony, nothing is rushed. Every movement is intentional. Every sound matters. The clink of the bowl, the way the tea is poured. Even the silence between gestures is part of the experience. In bonsai, the art is not in forcing growth, but in guiding it gently over time, through presence and patience. In sumi-e painting, the white space is as important as the brushstrokes. That space, the emptiness, is where the viewer breathes, and that's the point. Metaphors create mental white space. They leave room for your own meaning to emerge. At this stage in the journey, the young student begins to understand that the master's teachings are everywhere, not just in the rare moments he speaks, but in the way he walks, how he listens, how he tends the garden. Nothing is random. Everything is a lesson. When the master serves tea, he's not just serving a drink. He's teaching rhythm, he's teaching attention, he's teaching respect without ever naming it. And when he walks through the garden in silence, he's saying, "This is how you carry yourself through the world." The student no longer needs to ask. He's begun to listen with his eyes, with his body, with his breath. The shift is subtle but irreversible. It's no longer about collecting information. It's about becoming a different kind of observer. Alan Watts, one of the first Westerners to interpret Eastern philosophy for a modern audience, put it best. Trying to explain the Tao is like trying to nail down the wind. You can feel it, dance with it, be moved by it, but the moment you try to control it, it disappears. The same is true of wisdom. The harder you chase it, the more it slips through your fingers. That's why the master doesn't lecture. That's why he speaks, in riddles and metaphors, because the only lesson worth learning is the one you arrive at yourself. As this chapter closes, the student watches the master kneel by the water's edge. He says nothing. A single leaf falls onto the surface of the pond. The ripples spread outward, and for the first time, the student doesn't reach for meaning. He just watches. Time passed. What once felt confusing now seemed natural. The young student no longer waited for answers. He moved more slowly. He breathed more deeply. His hands found rhythm in the repetition of daily tasks. The frustration that once filled him had dissolved into stillness, and it was in that stillness that he finally understood the master had not changed. He had. The teaching was never in the words. It was in the spaces between them, in the way the master watched the rain, in how he folded his robe, in the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor at dawn. What the student once called silence was actually presence. This is the hidden truth behind the Japanese way of teaching. It's not about transmitting knowledge from one person to another. It's about creating the conditions for realization to emerge on its own. In Zen, there's a saying, Aishin Den Shin. It means from mind to mind without words. It refers to a kind of silent transmission, a moment when something deeper than language is exchanged between teacher and student. It's not explained. It's felt. In Japanese aesthetics, this principle appears everywhere, especially in the concept of ma, jian, the space between. Ma is the pause in music that makes the note meaningful, the silence in conversation that gives weight to the words, the space in a painting that invites the viewer to enter. Ma is not emptiness. It is the vital, breathing space where meaning lives. As the student deepens in his practice, he begins to experience this space within himself. He no longer fills every moment with thought. He no longer tries to grasp meaning with force. He waits, and in that waiting, wisdom begins to grow. Western culture, in contrast, often associates silence with awkwardness or ignorance. We're taught that those who speak most must know the most. That action is always better than stillness. But that's not how growth works. A seed must rest underground in the dark before it can bloom. A pot must have empty space to hold anything useful. And a mind must have silence to hear what truly matters. Science supports this too. A 2011 study from Harvard Medical School found that just 8 weeks of daily mindfulness practice, essentially structured silence, led to increased gray matter density in areas of the brain related to self-awareness and emotional regulation. Another study in Frontiers in Psychology 2021 found that students in contemplative learning environments, those where silence, reflection, and presence were emphasized, had higher levels of comprehension, empathy, and long-term learning retention. In other words, silence isn't passive, it's active listening, it's attention, sharpened. It's the condition for real transformation. By now, the student has stopped looking for answers. Instead, he watches the master closely. He imitates how the tea is prepared. He notices the way the master pauses before speaking or doesn't speak at all. And somewhere along the way, he stops thinking of himself as a student at all. He becomes a participant in a shared silence, and in that space he finds what he was searching for all along. This is the moment when the master might finally speak, but not because the student needs it, because now the student can actually hear. The words, when they come, are few, but they fall like stones into still water, and the ripples last for years. It's in this silence that real understanding blooms. Not as data to be stored, but as a way of being, a way of seeing, a way of living. The master was never teaching information. He was teaching a posture, a presence, a pattern of attention. And this is the wisdom we've forgotten. In a world obsessed with efficiency, noise, and instant answers, we've lost touch with the quiet rhythms of deep learning. We look for shortcuts, hacks, life formulas. But the most important lessons about love, loss, peace, meaning cannot be taught that way. They need time. They need space. They need silence, because silence isn't the absence of teaching. It's the presence of everything else. So what about you? What are you rushing to learn? What answers are you forcing? What truths have been trying to whisper to you, but couldn't be heard over the noise? Maybe the silence you've been avoiding is exactly where your next chapter begins. Maybe the questions you keep asking don't need answers. Maybe they need presence. Maybe they need you to stop stirring the water so you can finally see the bottom. As this story ends, imagine the student once more. He kneels in the garden. The wind brushes through the trees. A bird lands nearby and tilts its head. The master appears beside him. He doesn't speak. He simply places a single teacup beside the student and sits down. No instructions, no guidance, just the moment. And for the first time, the student doesn't wonder what it means. He just lifts the cup, breathes in the steam, and knows.